Hello, and welcome to the Communicators, a new interview series by Precy, where we chat with expert witnesses to tackle one big question: what makes an effective communicator? I'm Nick Connor, and this week we're thrilled to have Samuel Kasumu join us to help answer this question. Samuel was Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on civil society. He's a trustee and non-executive director of several organisations, and is the founder of Inclusive Boards, the firm that promotes diversity, inclusion in leadership and governance. He has recently published the book, The Power of the Outsider, A Journey of Discovery, in all good bookstores and rubbish ones as well. Welcome, Samuel.
Hey, Nick, good to see you. How you doing?
Good, thank you. Now, Samuel, when you're in Down the Street, you help lead the cross-departmental vaccine deployment. If I remember correctly, back at, from the newspapers during COVID, one of the challenges was vaccine take-up within the different groups and communities within society. So when you led this group, I mean, how did you take this broad message, get a vax, it's good for you, and translate that into the different groups and communities?
Yeah, Nick. So we were in, I think it was December 2020, when it became apparent that we had a vaccine or vaccines that could be deployed. And so the challenge for us at that time was, well, most people would reasonably assume that this was going to be an NHS project. You give a bunch of GPs and hospitals this vaccine, and then everybody's just going to take it, and then we will, resume some semblance of normality in our world. But it was very clear, increasingly clear, that actually there were variances around the types of people that were willing to even consider taking the vaccine. And so those differences were based on ethnicity, but also rural versus urban area. There were areas, there were variances. Your age, there was a lot of ambivalence amongst young people who were less likely to die from the vaccines, to be completely blunt, but perhaps equally as likely to spread the vaccine to those who could be at risk. And so you had this huge variance of different types of people who had different reasons why they were more likely or less likely to take it. And for some people, it was based on socioeconomic grouping. If you're slightly poorer, you're actually more likely to trust the government, even less. And so we had this strange dichotomy of, on one side, the need to encourage people to take it, and on the other side, very clear hesitancy amongst certain groups. And so what we had to do is find a way to have a clarity of message. This was our way out of the pandemic, but also a multifaceted approach to being able to engage with different types of audiences in a way that could positively influence their decision about whether or not to take the vaccine.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. If I cast my mind back, I think this is the first time where we saw governments trying to deal with sort of a mass news event, but they realizing that the news isn't, this is the BBC. News is now being spread in these different channels, and WhatsApp being a huge one. I remember I think WhatsApp stopped, or this carried on, stopped you mass forwarding messages to try and crack down on sort of fake news. I mean, how, with the spread of fake news, was there anything you're seeing, in different communities, being the
Yeah.
communication of choice? And, how do you tackle it? And, how do you put real news out, on those?
Yeah. I mean, I the vaccine deployment was probably the one time where I could fully utilize all of my communication skills because, fine, I've been involved in, referendums like you, Nick, general elections, local elections, and to a large extent, there's a lot of message discipline, and you have a job, specific job, sometimes in a specific silo, and you just have to play your part as part of a bigger team. But with the vaccine deployment, I was kind of like one of the folks in charge, and so I could do all the things I knew would help to engage with groups that others people couldn't, or people would argue were hard to reach. And so part of that, as you mentioned just now, Nick, was how do you deal with mis and disinformation? So we had a rapid response unit that we had set up in the cabinet office. We had a cross-departmental team looking at mis and disinformation because some of the responsibility did fit in the Home Office, whereas others were in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, etc., etc. So we had to convene the right people, and then we had to be very smart about when we chose to respond. Because the challenge with mis and disinformation is if you respond to certain things, you run the risk of highlighting, exacerbating, increasing the amount of people that engage with said subject. So sometimes you'd see things, and the best thing to do would be to just let it go. Other times, you'd of course hold social media companies to account and say, look, how are you dealing with this in a way that doesn't infringe on people's freedom of speech, but it allows at least for counter arguments. And this was before, Twitter had or X had community notes and what have you. And so there was a need to really say, look, no one's saying that people shouldn't be entitled to their own opinions. But ultimately, if false information is left unchecked, that will have a potentially adverse impact. But the broader challenge was, we had a clarity of objective. 75% of the population needed to, consider being inoculated for us to be able to resume some semblance of normality. So then how could we reach the different groups in different ways? And we used things like trusted voices, community leaders. We made sure that, we were very aware of certain behavioral insights to say, okay, two or three ways of meaningful engagement would allow people to maybe not necessarily change their mind, but at least give more consideration where they were really hesitant. And ultimately it worked. There are some groups that when we started the vaccine deployment, about 36% of such demography were interested in even considering taking the vaccine. By the time I'd left Downing Street, well over 75% of said groups had been inoculated. So there are ways that you could encourage people with a clarity of message, but a multi dimension in terms of your communication tools.
Yeah, that's interesting. And when you talked about people of influence and community leaders, I remember that being one of the real key sort of recipes for success, which he led on. And if you compare it to the normal political narrative, if you look to any of the political parties during the general election, I guess it's the same guys talking to the same people.
Mm-hmm.
Then they become a little bit more targeted, but pretty much all electorates, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dems,
Mm-hmm.
Reform, all chasing the same voter, which are, generally white, fairly well off people over the age of 60, right? So they don't really get to think in that granular way of how we're going to get to this demographic, how we're going to that demographic. And it's not necessarily getting the Queen doing the video, which might appeal to one demographic, which I think the political class was quite used to. But how do you talk to people who are not necessarily engaged in sort of the political talk, and sort of particularly inner cities and different communities and that, and getting those. How did you know that they were the right person, the right spokesperson to strike that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. As I say, being able to engage with different groups is my science, and so that's part of the reason why I was asked to go into to Downing Street. But ultimately, when it comes to political campaigning, you have two or three dominant figures who on both the right and on the left. In fact, on the left, you probably have one dominant figure really at the moment, who's the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. And they are able to move a campaign machine in a way that people would argue is unorthodox, but I would argue has become quite traditional. As you say, have a target group, make sure you understand what that group is passionate about, what matters to them, and have a messaging that is extremely simple, you know. And so I remember seeing the Keir Starmer flyer come through my door, and it had one word: change. And that was because the people of this country, the vast majority, but certainly the target groups, wanted said thing. When I was part of Boris Johnson's government in 2019 and we won the general election, it was very clear, get Brexit done. And so for a lot of campaigning at the moment, it's about simplicity of message and focusing on your target group very aggressively, right? And some people would even argue that you go even further and you create wedges. And so you're very aggressively targeting your core group and you're basically saying to hell with everybody else. But I believe there is another way to win elections. There are ways to win elections that focus on unifying messages. There are ways to win election that allows you to be viewed as a candidate that can rise above the noise, and there's a way to reach wider audiences. Now, in 2019, in to a large extent in 2020, when was the last election? 2024, and even before that, under Theresa May and David Cameron to an extent, I think there was a focus on saying no, just focus on your core group. But I think as demographics begin to evolve, and we know this country is changing in many ways in terms of how it looks, not only in terms of folks from different ethnicities, but we're getting older as well, and when many people can't afford to live in places like London, so we're even moving out to home counties and the like. And so as our demographics evolve, for parties to be able to maintain some semblance of relevance, they're going to have to eventually, maybe not today, but certainly in the years ahead, find different ways to engage with different audiences. And so it's a science that perhaps a few people specialize in, but it's extremely, for me, it's an extremely important way to think about how you are able to make an impact across board and not just with your target groups.
Now, is there any sort of best practices you're seeing, or either seeing in the business world or not being seen in the business world, which businesses can learn to hit? When I worked in finance, we called them sort of hard to reach demographics. And what we're finding is probably people are becoming much more hard to reach, or they're not actually becoming more hard to reach. So there's been a lot more siloed. So obviously we spoke a bit about different communities groups, but I think as time goes on, you'll find the different generations communicate in different ways. You have the analog generation on Facebook, so the baby boomers, when you're having sort of the younger sort of Gen Z guys who are, communicating much more on TikTok and different forms. They're more on videos, and WhatsApp messages seem to be sort of the equal playing field for everyone. So is there any way for businesses, is there any businesses which you're going, they're really good at taking one big broad mess and dissecting it and hitting different demographics, or is there a sort of anything businesses can learn by talking to specific groups and individuals?
Yeah, I mean, are there any brands that I've been looking at lately and thinking, your messaging has been completely impressive? Not really, not at the moment. So we'll park that one. I might come back to that slightly later on. But in terms of how you reach different audiences, or what a mass audience, whilst recognizing the need for segmentation, clearly, that is what most brands are now trying to focus their efforts on, because it's very risky to have a core audience very often that is your only audience. So you always have to find ways to diversify, expand, etc. I suppose the first thing I would say is you have to segment and then understand where each segment of that market is, or potential market is. And so, are they on TikTok? Are they on Snapchat? Are they on Instagram? Are they on Facebook? Are they on Twitter or X, which I keep calling Twitter, or what have you, right? So first you've got to segment who they are and where they're at. And then the second thing you have to figure out is what type of messaging works for them. And so, what might work on LinkedIn might not work on Instagram, for example. And so there's a need for slight adaptations. And then, of course, the message is not the only thing that matters, it's the messengers as well. So who are the people that are your standard bearers? I think people talk a lot about utilizing influencers for ads and stuff. And to be honest, when we did the vaccine deployment, we did utilize influencers, and that was relatively successful. But actually, when it comes to influencers, it's not just about finding someone on social media that has 1 million followers. Sometimes the most impactful influencer is the person who is the expert in the field. And so you find an expert and you allow them to add credibility to what you are selling. I think sometimes that's even more powerful than just having someone with loads of followers post something that is not always genuine. So yeah, I think that's what I would say. The segmentation, where are they, and who are the people carrying your message? And of course, how are they carrying it? Is it clear? Is it simple enough for people to run with? Is it interesting enough for people to want to engage with? And so, yeah, I mean, you know, we talk about the vaccine. I talk about vaccine deployment a lot because that's what I suppose people remember I did. But you know, many moons ago, I think the first large campaign of that sort that I was involved in was Startup Loans Program. And so when the late Lord Young set it up, I remember I was working in the House of Commons and they had only lent to 60 people when they had 120 million pounds to disperse. And so I left. I set up a campaign to support the Startup Loans Initiative. And over a number of years, we supported about 6,000 people across the UK, various regions. And so that was probably the one of the first large campaigns where I had to find ways to engage with different groups. But the science was still the same. Simple message, understand your segmentation, and find interesting ways to engage with them with people that they found credible. I remember I did a campaign on YouTube with some comedians, and to this day it's one of their most viewed projects. I think over 700,000 views and through that campaign, and it's still there to this day. And I would say that was where I was able to exercise that muscle. Yes, I've done it in politics, but actually the principles do apply in business too.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Before we dive in deeper, let me just take a moment to tell our listeners a bit more about Prusy. Prusy are specialists in communications, helping organizations achieve their commercial objectives, whether that's raising their profile, boosting their revenue, or attracting new clients and investors. We combine traditional PR and public affairs engagements with marketing and content led strategies, focused on delivering the outcomes our clients need, not just ticking the boxes. Now, Samuel, you were the most senior black advisor in government. I've heard you say that actually being black wasn't necessarily what made you an outsider in Down the Street. I mean, your upbringing is as large a factor as well. You know, raised in a working class London would give you a different perspective than, you know, the private school kids from the home counties. I mean, we've heard you talk about, you know, you being in the room and offering this different perspective when it came to the vax deployment. I mean, was this one of your superpowers?
Yeah, I mean, look, my ethnicity is you know a significant part of my identity, and when it came to the vaccine deployment, of course, I could understand, engage with certain groups the way that some of my colleagues couldn't. I also had networks where my colleagues didn't. You know, we were able to get Lenny Henry, for example, to lead on one of the big projects linked to the vaccine deployment, and so that just simply wouldn't have happened if I couldn't lean on certain people to make things happen, right? Um, and actually, in terms of the vaccine deployment, being able to work across government was also something that I was able to do because of some of the links I had with folks that were perhaps not natural bedfellows politically, but because of our maybe cultural heritage, our actually political heritage and student politics, I was able to pick up the phone, and they could trust that I wasn't going to do anything that was incorrect, and which again some of my colleagues just simply couldn't do. So there's a value in having people around who understand different groups and are from different backgrounds. But as you say, Nick, I from a working class background, lived in a single parent home, grew up in social housing, just not the typical kind of person that at least when I was there ends up in Downing Street as an advisor, right? But I would argue that part of the reason why I ended up in Downing Street was because I have always been able to, I suppose, find a way to focus on the value that I bring. And so the main value I always felt and feel I bring to politics is being able to reach audiences that other people cannot, but in a scientific way that adds value to a campaign or a political project. Yeah, so I think and from a social class perspective, clearly, there's still a long way to go. Labour have made a lot of progress in terms of people from working class backgrounds on their front benches. I think this is the first time that I don't think anyone in the cabinet went to a fee paying school. as far as I'm aware. You might want to fact check that. And there's nothing wrong with going to a fee-paying school. It's just how do you make sure that there is a multiplicity of voices where decisions are being made. And in fact, I would argue that actually, if they did have at least one person who maybe was from a working class or middle class background, whose parents worked really hard to send them to a fee-paying school, they may not have made some of the decisions that they've made recently. So it's not. I always tell people to include doesn't mean to exclude, and very
Yeah, no,
often
that's interesting. If you, and you're almost seeing the flip now with Labour. You don't have many from a rural background,
Mm,
and I think if they had one person, let's just say your farmer minister became they came from a rural constituency, rural area, they would have been able to say that actually doing this sort of thing would actually hurt a large group of people, and probably not a good idea. So I guess it's about the live experience, and to be slightly controversial, I like to be a little bit controversial, but if you look around at people of color, yes, they bring one perspective, cultural perspectives, but it
mm,
doesn't necessarily mean they connect with all people of color. Everyone's different. Everyone's has a different perspective of life, and actually, where you went to school, where you went to university, did you go to university? Did you
mm.
come from a single family household? They matter as much, because what it is, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's having a bit of understanding, a bit of empathy, a bit of knowledge of what ticks for.
Yeah, yeah. And look, the reality is, we live in a world now or society now where people are struggling to make sense of the moment that they're in. So, as I said, we look different. We have economic challenges. The world is evolving. Technology, automation, artificial intelligence is basically going to take lots of people's jobs in the years ahead. So everyone is trying to work out how they respond to that. And as a result, sometimes, firstly, people do get it wrong. And other times people just are, you know, lack empathy and perhaps are not don't respond at all, right? And so, as you mentioned, we've got a Secretary of State who is an MP for Croydon. I love Croydon. I was a parliamentary candidate in Croydon in 2017. It's a lovely, lovely part of the world. My brother actually currently lives in Croydon, so he's a Croydonian. But nonetheless, what does he know about rural Britain? What, like, and instead of him maybe approaching it with great humility, I think he's probably done the opposite. And so there's a need to have people, different voices in the room when you're making decisions, because very often that lived experience is a cheaper and richer way of getting knowledge than somebody picking up a book or somebody being the subject expert because they've studied it somewhere or they read a few articles, right? And so I think there's a balance to be struck. But we're all just trying to figure it out. I'm very gracious about how I respond to people's ignorance, because I'm sure I have my own blind spots as well.
Yeah, and your book you've written is The Power of the Outsider. And I
Mm,
guess being an outsider, and and well, let's blend both Power of the Outsider and your company Inclusive Boards. When you are making up a board, and it's trying to find those outsider voices, I guess, because actually sometimes it's not as basic as if you wanted to have a diverse pool of voices, it's not necessarily about ethnicity or your gender or anything like that. It could
mm,
be, well, what is your upbringing,
mm,
what is your life experience. Sometimes it's probably more granular than some of the boxes to
mm.
to bring sort of diverse and different teams. What are sort of the lessons sort of businesses can learn from
Yeah.
thinking that one step more.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I set up inclusive boards because partly because I felt like if you get good people in positions where decisions are being made, then you make better decisions, which accelerates the pace of change, right? And so it's the best way to to send a signal is by having a board that actually is reflective of, the values and the society you wish to have. And it's a lot easier to have a good board than it is to have a senior leadership team, because if somebody's crap on a senior leadership team, it's very difficult to get rid of them or very expensive. And whereas, you got up to like 12 chances to have good people on a board, right? And so in many respects, you start at the top and then you work your way down, in my opinion. And some of the lessons are, yes, good people. Second is skills first. The last thing you want, or anybody wants, is to be a token. And so, if a client comes to us and says, look, we need more women or more ethnicity on the board, it's like, yeah, sure, we can help you with that. We've got, the largest network of its kind of senior leaders from diverse backgrounds. That's no issue. But what is the skill? Because I'm not going to go to somebody who is a woman who is a CFO of a company, who has achieved so many great things in their career, and who's overqualified for a board role, to say, well, somebody's looking for a woman, so would you like to come? It has to be first, well, these are the skills that you bring to the table, and this is why we think there is an alignment, and then values, etc. So skills first as well. And then the other thing I would say is, it's quite important that a board is managed in a way that allows everybody to feel like they are included. And so if you're a digital expert, and you join a board because everybody needs to be, strong in terms of their digital presence in this day and age. And so if that's why you come there, that doesn't mean that you go quiet, you fall quiet when the questions around the budget or finances come up, because you're equally as responsible. And so boards need to be developed in a way that allows people to ask questions that people might feel are silly, that allows people from different backgrounds to feel like their voices can be heard, but also allows people to grow and develop. They're the things that I would say. We've come a long way as a nation since we set up inclusive boards, and I'd like to think we've played a hand in that. But there's still a long way to go. And actually, in this current climate, we're seeing quite a bit of regression because, of course, people are quite sensitive about, this idea of inclusion and diversity, and understandably so. A lot of organizations have invested, lots of money into trying to be more inclusive, and what they found is that sometimes their organizations have regressed. They feel the cultures feel a bit even more toxic. People don't still feel like their voices aren't being heard. So all the things that they've tried to do, yeah, it hasn't quite worked. And so, I can completely understand why people are pushing back. And also because a lot of maybe inclusion experts have actually done their work through an ideological lens, which has meant that a lot of people feel like, actually, for me to include more people means I have to be excluded. So if I look like Nick, I can't apply for a job. Or I'm not going to get the job. And so obviously that's not the way you want a world to function. The pie is big enough for everybody to have a piece. And so your mantra, your development, and of course, people that look like Nick aren't, be more disadvantaged in many ways. You could be neurodiverse. You come from a working class background. You come from a rural area. You could be the first in your family to have gone to university. And so this idea that what you see, is all that matters, is also some part of the challenge, right? And so, yeah, we're all just trying to work it out, and we try to play our part.
Yeah, and I guess it's the whole reason about how diverse boards and diverse senior leadership is to bring different voices. And I'm so glad you talked about bringing people with digital background. One of the campaigns we ran a couple of years ago for one of our clients was sort of tech neds. Was actually trying to get more people with a tech background onto boards, because they might be talking about something, but no one's considering the AI or the digital implications. It could be anything from a data breach, could be crippling for a company, to how do you recruit. The tech ned could say, well, we shouldn't be recruiting loads of people here because we're going to automate this in a few years. Having that different terms of experience is where it's at. Do you think, and I think businesses are getting that a bit now, but do you think that sort of diversity is in government? Is there anything government can learn about having, people with different experiences, bit of background in?
Yeah, I mean, government's too big. So right now, I feel like the focus should be more on, like, relieving civil servants of their duties. Which just sounds very extremely controversial, and actually, it's not always helpful for me to say something like this. But if you're patriotic and you have to be honest about these things. But 400,000 civil servants in our government is too much. It should probably be closer to two-thirds of that at best. And so the challenge for us is, how do you reduce the size of the state? And with Labour, a lot of their challenge that they have today is it's very difficult to reduce headcount in the civil service, especially when you're not the permanent secretary or a politico. And so they're currently focused significantly on reducing the number of arm's length bodies, which is where they feel like they can maybe get more progress in the short term. Again, this is not an ideological point. 45p on every pound we spend in the UK is spent by our government. And so we are in a strange position where people don't think anything's working, but we're spending lots of money on stuff, right? But aside from that, I think that there are two things that are going to happen in the future. One is automation will mean there will be a reduction a radical reduction in headcount if Keir Starmer can push it ahead with some of the things that are on his agenda, which means that actually the future of work in the public sector, the people who can understand and maximize the value of automation. And so, how do you then encourage people like that into the civil service? Well, clearly you're going to have to remunerate them quite well. And secondly, you're going to have an inspiring and compelling project. And for me, reducing the size of the state could be no more an inspiring project for someone who's passionate about technology. I think that is going to be the biggest shift in how we are governed. In fact, the only jobs that are safe are the politicians because they're the ones making decisions, right? Everybody else, pretty much in the public sector, should be on alert.
Heard it here first. Become a politician. Thank you so much, Samuel. I've been Nick Connor, and you've been listening to The Communicators, interview series by Parisi. If you have any question for us or Samuel, drop them in the comments, and don't forget to give us a like. Be sure to tune in next time. Thank you.